Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins.
In the hush of twilight, when the stars first begin to prick the velvet dome of the sky, and the world draws breath beneath a blanket of silver mist, there lies a place untouched by the haste of time, a realm folded in golden leaves and the music of ancient trees. This is Lothlórien, the golden wood, the fairest of elven realms in Middle-earth. Here the Melorn trees rise like columns of moonlight, their leaves shimmering like woven gold even in winter, and beneath them flows the timeless grace of memory and morning. It was after the fellowship had departed, their footsteps barely brushing the soft earth, that the first signs of change stirred in Lothlórien. The great wood still sang with the voices of leaves and streams, and yet there was a silence beneath the song, a stillness in the air, a pause in the breath of the forest, like a heart preparing to grieve. Lothlórien, a young sylvan elf, wandered the winding paths of the forest in solitude. His heart, though bound in duty, was restless. For many years he had served as a guardian of the borders, his bow sharp, his ears keen, his spirit fierce in its love for the golden wood. But now, though the lands beyond the river remained distant and troubled, the sorrow he felt was not born of war. It was gentler, deeper, and without name. He stood beneath the high canopy of a Melorn tree one dusk, his silver blonde hair tangled in the breeze. The light was dimming, and yet it was not night. It was the light of endings. He pressed his palm to the tree's bark, and it felt cool to the touch, cooler than it should have been. "They weep already," said a voice behind him, soft and full of unspoken weight. He turned to find Rumiel, elder of the border guard, his gray eyes distant as if they gazed into other times. "The trees know," Rumiel said. "Galadriel will not remain much longer." Ilarion's breath caught, though he had long suspected as much. "Then the heart of Lórien will fade." Rumiel nodded slowly, his hand brushing a falling leaf that drifted like a golden tear through the air. "Not fade, change. That is the way of things, even for us. But come, the lady has called for you." And so Ilarion walked the winding paths to Caras Galadon, the heart of the realm, where the great trees cradled platforms of light and memory. He passed beneath branches that had known the stars before men had spoken names to them. And in the hush of their presence, he felt again the weight of time, gentle and vast like the tide. Galadriel stood at the foot of the silver stair, not upon her throne but beneath the sky. The stars made a crown about her golden hair, and her eyes, ancient and bright, shone with the sorrow of a farewell unspoken. Beside her stood a man cloaked in gray and green, his features thoughtful, his hair touched with the early threads of silver. He bowed low as Ilarion approached, though there was nothing servile in the gesture. "This is Maeldir," Galadriel said, "a scholar of Gondor, seeker of wisdom. He has come for counsel, and perhaps for more." Ilarion inclined his head. "You are welcome in Lórien, though her light wanes." Maeldir smiled, though it was a smile marked by sadness. "Then I have come in time." Galadriel looked between them. "You will journey together, for there is a task yet to be done, one that touches upon the heart of Lórien herself. You must carry a vial of the mirror's water to Hirelorn, the ancient tree where Arwen once dwelt. Beneath its roots you will bury it, and there it will remain until the world forgets even the name of Lórien. Ilarien's brow furrowed. To what end, my lady? Galadriel's voice softened. To preserve memory, even as the world turns away, to plant sorrow and beauty like a seed. For when the last song is sung and the last leaf falls, there must still be remembrance. That is the task. She held out the vial, slender, delicate, filled with light like starlit water. Ilarion took it reverently, and in that moment he felt the weight of all that was being left behind. That night, Lothlórien breathed in silence. Ilarion did not sleep, for elves do not dream as men do, but he walked beside the river, where the waters whispered secrets to the stones, and he thought of the days when laughter had filled the air like birdsong, when Arwen had danced beneath the Malorns, and the light of the Lady's grace had been undimmed. Meldir found him there at dawn, his cloak damp with dew, his eyes fixed on a world he had not known but had studied in scrolls and song. You have seen much, he said to Ilarion, but I wonder, what will it mean to let it go? Ilarion did not answer at first. He looked toward the heart of the forest, where Caras Galadon shimmered in the morning light, and a lone Malorn leaf floated gently down to land upon the river. It means, he said at last, that we must become what we remember. They departed that morning beneath branches of gold and green, following the winding path that led away from the heart of the wood. As they walked, the light played upon the leaves above, and the trees hummed softly, as if singing a lullaby to the ones who would carry their memory forward. But even as their footsteps faded into the hush of the forest, the first true sign of sorrow came. A scattering of golden leaves, fallen too early, resting upon the trail like petals from a weeping flower. Far behind them, Galadriel stood upon a high Telon, her gaze turned westward, her heart already adrift upon the sea. And Lothlórien sighed. They walked beneath the great Malorn trees, whose trunks gleamed like the bones of the world, lit from within by some ancient fire long remembered but never seen. The light that fell through their golden canopies was unlike the light of the sun or stars. It was a memory of light, softened by the dreaming of ages, refracted through leaves that shimmered like the thoughts of the Valar themselves. The forest breathed in silence, but not an absence of sound. It was the silence of deep music, of a song too vast and old to be heard by ears alone. It was the hush of something sacred nearing its end. Beleriand's steps were measured, graceful, as though he walked not upon earth, but through the pages of memory itself. The vial of water which he carried in a pouch close to his chest pulsed with a faint glow, its contents gently stirring, as though the mirror's water mourned its parting from the lady's hand. He did not look at it, not yet. To do so would feel like reading the final line of a tale before its beginning was properly told. He preferred instead to listen to the soft rustle of leaves, to the occasional call of a night bird even in the day, to the very rhythm of the world as it slowly folded inward. Beside him, Meldir walked with the steady determination of men, but even his pace was subdued, as though he too felt the weight of the place and the task. His eyes were those of a scholar, but they held more than curiosity, They held grief, a kind of reverent sorrow for a world he had never known and never would. After many hours of walking in silence, it was he who finally broke it. And when he did, his voice was not loud, but gentle, as though afraid of waking the dreams that slumbered in the trees. "I had thought," he said slowly, "that coming here would give me answers, that the wisdom of the elves would unlock some hidden door in my understanding of the world. But now I see that the wisdom of the elves is not in what they say, but in what they keep, in the things left unspoken, in the spaces between words." Hilarion did not speak immediately, for he was accustomed to the patience of the forest, to letting thoughts ripen like fruit in autumn before they were given voice. But after a time he replied, and his words came slowly as if drawn from a deep well. "We are like the trees," he said. "We remember what others forget, not because we cling to the past, but because the past clings to us. Our roots reach back through the years, and sometimes the winds of the present stir the dust of memories so ancient that even the stars have grown weary of them. What we do not say is often what we most deeply feel." Meldir nodded, his brow furrowed as though the words had struck some buried chord. "Then tell me," he said, pausing beneath a vast arching branch that cradled the sky like the arm of some forgotten giant, "what do the trees remember of her, of Galadriel?" Hilarion turned his gaze upward, where the sunlight scattered in golden coins upon the leaves. He placed a hand upon the bark of the tree nearest to him, and the touch was gentle, reverent, like the brushing of lips to the brow of a sleeping child. "They remember her as light made flesh," he said at length, "as a voice that could soothe the fury of storms, as the evening star that never sets. They do not think of her as queen or sorceress or even as one of the wise. They think of her as we think of song. She is melody that grew roots, hope that took shape and breath. And now they feel her leaving, not as a sound, but as its echo fading into silence." The path curved before them like a silver ribbon laid over green moss, and they followed it deeper into the heart of the forest. The wind began to rise, softly at first, then with more insistence, rustling the Lothlórien leaves into a whispering tide. It was not an ordinary wind. It carried with it the scent of time, dry leaves, sun-warmed bark, the sweetness of things ending. Hilarion closed his eyes and breathed it in, letting it wrap around him like the cloak of a memory long left folded at the foot of an empty bed. Meldir walked in silence for a time, then said, "In Gondor we have no trees like these. Ours are proud and strong, but they do not sing. They do not remember. We speak of legacy in terms of stone and steel, of names carved into marble, but here your legacy lives and breathes. It weeps when you leave. And yet," Hilarion replied, "even the Lothlórens must one day fall silent. The roots of this forest are deep, but the tide of the world rises, and not even song can hold back the sea forever." They came upon a clearing then, and the light opened above them like a benediction. In the center stood a lone fountain, fed by a stream that ran through carved stones covered in moss, singing to itself in a forgotten tongue. The water sparkled with a light not wholly of the sun, and beside it a ring of white flowers bloomed despite the season, their petals curved like crescent moons. Lothlórien knelt by the fountain and dipped his fingers into the water. "This is the spring of Nainal," he said, "named for the tears of stars. It is said that when the first sorrow came into the world, the stars wept, and where their tears fell, this spring was born. We stop here not to rest, but to remember. All journeys must pause in sorrow." Meldir knelt beside him, touching the water with a scholar's care but a mourner's reverence. "And what sorrow is this place remembering?" Lothlórien looked across the fountain, through the tall reeds and moss-covered stones. "The sorrow of farewell that comes before parting. The sorrow that knows it cannot change what must be, but weeps all the same. This is where Arwen once stood when she chose the path of mortality. She wept here not because she doubted her choice, but because she loved what she was giving up. Even the joy of love cannot silence the mourning of leaving." Meldir sat in silence, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with unshed tears. "Why is it," he asked, "that the greatest beauty is always shadowed by loss? That even the golden woods are filled with endings?" Lothlórien's eyes, deep as wells unnumbered by time, lifted to the sky. "Because without loss, beauty would have no edge. Without endings, no moment would have meaning. The pain of departure is the proof of love. Lothlórien weeps not for herself, but for all those who will never know what she was." The wind stirred the water between them, and the flowers trembled on their stems. Somewhere far off, the cry of a white bird rang through the trees, clear, piercing, and sad. They remained by the fountain until the sun began to dip, its light painting the world in amber and bronze. And then, with hearts heavy but steady, they rose and turned once more to the path. Above them the malorns wept golden leaves like a soft rain of memory, and the forest watched them go. The path wound on like a forgotten melody, hummed beneath breath, trailing softly through the groves of gold and the shadows of still, ancient trees that arched overhead as though in solemn reverence. The air had changed, not in temperature or weight, but in spirit. It had grown more thoughtful, more pensive, as if the forest itself sensed that something sacred was being carried within it. Something not heavy in the way a stone is heavy, but heavy in the way a memory can become unbearable when one dares to speak it aloud. The Maldorns whispered with every step, their leaves rustling not as mere foliage stirred by wind, but as the voices of elders murmuring over the beds of sleeping children, telling them stories they might never understand, but should never forget. Ilarion walked as one who carried more than his own footsteps, and indeed he did. The vial pressed against his heart like a quiet heartbeat not his own, and every time he passed beneath a branch or between two trunks that formed a natural archway, he felt as if deep within his bones that he was crossing not merely distance, but time itself. At his side, Meldir remained silent for a long while, lost in thought, his eyes absorbing the forest as though he were memorizing each detail, each tree knot and trailing vine, with the desperation of a man who knew that someday soon only memory would remain. Eventually, when they came upon a stretch where the light filtered through in long, liquid bands of gold, pooling at their feet like offerings of forgotten gods, Meldir spoke again. But his voice had changed, lower, slower, as though he had to find his way carefully through the forest of his own thoughts. "I have often wondered," he began, "if perhaps memory itself is the last true form of magic left to us. not the kind that commands fire or transforms the shape of things, but the kind that preserves, that honors, that holds the shape of love even after the hands that shaped it are gone. You elves, you seem to understand this innately, but men are always racing. We run toward futures we cannot see, tripping over legacies we do not understand. We are born into a world already crumbling, and we call it progress. He paused, placing a hand gently on the bark of a tree whose surface shimmered faintly with veins of silver, like moonlight caught in wood. His fingers lingered there, his brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in reverence. You see, he continued, we are taught to build empires of stone and steel, but those are only monuments to the self. What endures is what is loved, what is mourned, and yet so few of us ever think to ask what it means to leave the world better, not with power or invention, but with remembrance. Ilarion slowed, turning toward him fully, the light glinting off the soft curves of his face and the ageless clarity in his gaze. His expression was not solemn, it was tender, like a father gazing upon a son who had just spoken wisdom he did not know he possessed. There is truth in your words, Ilarion said, his voice like the slow unfolding of petals in spring, and it humbles me to hear it from one of your kind, for so often it is thought that we elves speak only in riddles and remembrances, as though our grief makes us cryptic. But what you say, memory is magic, yes, it is, and perhaps it is the deepest magic of all, because to remember is to resist the erosion of time. It is to hold shape in the face of decay, to say this mattered, and I carry it still. He paused and his hand drifted to the pouch over his chest. This vial, this water, it is not merely liquid from a sacred pool. It is the reflection of all she has seen, all she has grieved, all she has loved. It is a memory made visible, and to carry it to Hirelorn is not to bury it, but to root it, like a seed that even in darkness might grow into light again. Meldir's eyes moistened, but he did not look away. And yet, he whispered, how many will ever know that it was planted? How many will walk beneath its shade and feel nothing? Ilarion smiled, not out of joy, but with that particular melancholy unique to immortals, who have watched beauty fade more times than they can count. Perhaps none. Perhaps the world will grow louder and crueler, and no song will ever again be heard in these lands. But that does not make the act meaningless. To plant beauty knowing it may go unseen, that is the highest act of love. It is the offering we make to time, to say, you may take all things, but I give this freely, not for glory, but for grace. As they continued forward, the forest began to shift around them. The trees thinned ever so slightly, and the undergrowth grew softer, more delicate, as if they were descending into the dreaming of the woods themselves. Here the light was bluer, touched with the silver sheen of mist. The air was cooler, but not cold, refreshing like breath after long silence. Strange flowers bloomed in hidden clusters, their petals unfolding as the two travelers passed, leaning slightly toward the warmth of their footsteps. It was as though the forest had recognized the vial, or perhaps the task it bore, and had opened its heart to cradle them. They came upon a bridge then, not of stone, but of roots. Roots that had twisted themselves over a narrow stream in the manner of a woven braid, forming an elegant arc of living wood. Beneath it, the water ran dark and quiet, its surface broken only by the occasional falling leaf which drifted down like forgotten words spoken only once. Lothlórien paused before crossing, laying a hand upon the nearest root. His eyes closed, and for a long moment he was still, his breath shallow, his form tense with quiet reverence. When he spoke, it was almost a whisper. This bridge is called Etheldor, the Whispering Span. It is said that every time one crosses it with a burden of the heart, the stream below remembers the sorrow, and it carries that memory to the roots of every tree it touches downstream. There is no loss that is truly lost, only remembered elsewhere, reshaped in silence. Meldir stepped to the edge and looked down at the water, his reflection wavering, his eyes shadowed by the dimming canopy. "Then let it remember mine," he murmured, "for I have carried the burden of knowing that we are too late, that the beauty we see now is already dying, that by the time our children walk these paths they will be bare, and the songs that live in these leaves will be gone." Silmarillion did not deny it. He placed a hand on Meldir's shoulder, slightly, gently, as though to anchor him, and together they stepped across the bridge. The wood beneath their feet sighed faintly, a sound so soft it could have been imagined, and the water below caught their sorrow like rain. And still they walked on, toward Lothlórien, toward the end of what had always been, toward the tree that remembered love and loss and stood, alone, waiting to be wept beneath once more. The land began to slope gently upward, almost imperceptibly at first, but with a gathering insistence, as though guiding them not merely in direction, but into elevation of thought, into that hushed and sacred space where the roots of legend entwine with the pulse of living memory. The trees grew older here, if such a thing could be said in a forest already ancient, yet these bore the wear of years, not in weakness, but in dignity. Their trunks twisted with grace, gnarled like the hands of wise elders, and their bark bore patterns that resembled ancient runes, as though time itself had chosen them as its parchment, inscribing secrets into their skin for the wind to read. The light filtered differently here, veiled through soft mist and speckled shadow, and the air carried not merely scent but emotion, a strange mingling of peace and sorrow, like the perfume of a place that has known both song and silence, and remembers them equally. Lothlórien walked more slowly now, as if the path itself required it, as if haste would break something fragile beneath their feet. The vial beneath his tunic had grown colder, its luminescence dimming not in weakness but in stillness, like a candle bracing itself against wind. He touched it briefly, not to reassure himself of its presence, but as a gesture of communion, of silent agreement between carrier and carried. Behind him, Meldir breathed softly, as one might breathe upon entering a place of worship not built by hands but born of earth and time. It was Meldir who spoke first, his voice low and filled with the kind of hesitation that belongs not to doubt but to reverence, as though he feared to break the stillness that hung like fine silk around them. "Do you believe," he said, "that places can grieve, that the land itself can carry sorrow, not just as a record of events, but as a living feeling that seeps into the roots and the stones and the water until it becomes a part of the place's very soul?" Lothlórien did not answer at once. He closed his eyes and placed his hand against the moss-covered bark of a nearby tree, his fingers splayed as though trying to listen through touch. The bark was damp and soft, like aged parchment long wept upon, and in its silence he felt the echo of many things, departures, yes, and endings, but also promises whispered and never kept, laughter that once rippled like bells through the glades and now only lingered as memory in the scent of the leaves. "Yes," he said after a time, his voice like the hush that follows a sacred name spoken aloud. "Yes, I believe they do. For places are not merely shaped by events, they are wounded by them, changed by them. Just as a harp carries the memory of the songs once played upon its strings, even after the strings fall silent, so too does the land carry the resonance of what has been loved and what has been lost." Mildir nodded slowly, gazing up into the towering branches above. "Then this place is full of grief," he murmured. "Not loud grief, not the kind that rends clothing and cries to the heavens, but something quieter, more dignified, like a widow who still sets 2 places at the table, though one seat remains forever empty. It is beautiful, and it is heartbreaking." Lothlórien smiled faintly, though his eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "You understand more than most who walk these woods. The sorrow of Lothlórien is not bitter. It does not claw or accuse. It simply lingers, like the scent of a flower long faded. It teaches us to carry beauty with us." The path opened then, as though the trees themselves had stepped aside, revealing a wide glade bathed in the pale silver of a sky beginning to dim into evening. In the center stood Hirelorn, the tree of queenship, of solitude, of ancient choice. It rose impossibly high, its trunk vast and smooth as marble, glowing faintly in the twilight like moonstone, its roots tangled and wide, spreading like a net across the forest floor. Its branches reached upward like the arms of one in prayer, or perhaps one in farewell. And every leaf upon it was the color of memory. Neither gold nor green, but some in-between shade that shimmered with the weight of emotion. The 2 travelers paused at the edge of the glade, not because they feared to enter, but because some part of them knew they stood on the threshold of something final. Not an ending in the sense of death, but in the sense of completion, of a chapter closed with reverent hands, sealed with the wax of longing. Mildir's voice broke the silence again, but softer now, almost a whisper. "This is where she lived," he said. "Arwen, she chose her fate beneath this tree, didn't she? Chose to stay, to fade, to love, knowing it would end." Lothlórien nodded, his eyes tracing the broad lines of the tree's trunk, as if reading a scroll written in bark and time. "Yes, here she waited, and here she wept, and here she chose love over light, and mortality over memory. The choice of Luthien echoed again in her, and in every one of us who remains behind when those we love cross the sea." Mildir looked at the base of the tree, where the roots rose like cathedral steps. "Is that what we do now?" he asked. "Remain behind, bear the memory so others may forget." Lothlórien's hand brushed the pouch once more, and he stepped forward, his voice clear but thick with the weight of emotion. "No," he said, "we do more than remain. We remember, we sanctify, we turn grief into beauty and memory into offering. That is the task." They moved as one toward the base of the tree, and as they did, the light shifted again, not brighter, not darker, but deeper, as if they had stepped into a moment outside of time, held in the palm of something greater than them both. Ilarion knelt beside the roots, his fingers brushing aside fallen leaves that seemed reluctant to part, as if they too mourned what was to come. He reached into the pouch and drew forth the vial. It glowed faintly now, pale as starlight seen through mist, and as he held it in his hands, it seemed to hum softly, like a lullaby remembered from a childhood long forgotten. He looked to Meldir then, and the man knelt beside him, his eyes wide, his breath shallow, as though he stood before the sacred heart of the world. "You may do the honors," Ilarion said. Meldir shook his head. "I am not worthy." "No," Ilarion replied gently, "none of us are. And yet it must be done." With trembling hands, Meldir reached forward, and together they lifted a stone between the roots, revealing dark, damp earth below, rich with the scent of centuries. Meldir lowered the vial into the hollow, and Ilarion covered it again with soil, his fingers moving with the tenderness of one laying a child to sleep. And then silence. Not empty, but full. A silence that held everything they had brought, and everything they had left behind. Above them Hirelorn sighed, and a single leaf fell. Not golden, not green, but the color of a dream fading at dawn. And the world for a moment held its breath. Even after the earth had been gently pressed back over the resting place of the vial, and the last traces of its silver light had been swallowed by the darkness of the soil, neither Ilarion nor Meldir rose to their feet, as though the very act of standing might somehow violate the sacred stillness that had settled over the glade. They remained kneeling, heads bowed, not in ritual formality, but in honest reverence. And their silence was not absence of thought, but an offering in and of itself. A silence so full of presence that the forest seemed to gather close around it, listening, breathing, remembering. Hirelorn stood above them like a witness who needed no explanation, her roots sheltering the buried memory, her branches brushing the upper sky, and her leaves rustling softly in the wind, like sighs spoken in the language of the stars. Meldir was the first to speak, but even then his voice was hushed and halting, as though he were trying to put into words something that did not wish to be named. "I feel," he said slowly, "as though we have left behind not just an object, not just a token or relic or symbol, but a part of ourselves, as if something that once lived within me now lies sleeping in that earth, as if the weight I carried is no longer mine, and yet I do not feel lighter, only changed." Ilarion turned to him, his eyes soft, his expression touched with a sadness that had become almost familiar, like a cloak worn often and without complaint. "Yes," he said, "that is the nature of true acts, of acts that matter. They do not release us from weight, they transform it. When we offer something precious, we do not become emptier, we become deeper. We make space for grief to settle into us like roots seeking soil, and though we may walk forward from that place, we carry its shape within us forever." Meldir looked up into the branches of Hirelorn, into the vast lattice of limbs crisscrossed against the darkening sky, their forms seeming almost like veins in the hand of the world, pulsing with the quiet blood of memory. "I used to think," he said, "that the greatest tragedy of mortality was that we forget, that our stories fade, our names are lost, and what we build crumbles. But now I wonder, perhaps it is not forgetting that wounds us most. Perhaps it is remembering, because to remember is to hold what is gone, and holding what is gone is to bleed with every heartbeat. Elarian's gaze did not waver, but his breath caught slightly, as if the words had stirred some echo deep within him. "You speak like one who has lived long, though your years are few," he said, "and perhaps it is because you have chosen to listen, not only to me or to the forest, but to the ache inside your own chest, which is the truest mirror of all. We elves, we do not forget, and it is both our gift and our sorrow. We carry all things, and so we are heavy with beauty and pain alike." The wind passed through the glade then, not with violence or urgency, but like a gentle hand brushing back the hair of a sleeping child. And with it came a sudden cascade of leaves, hundreds at once, drifting down in spirals and arcs, gilded in the last rays of evening like coins scattered across a marble floor. They fell not merely as debris, but as witness, as benediction, as though the tree itself, ancient and wise, had chosen to weep in its own way. Some landed upon the two kneeling figures, resting lightly on shoulders and arms and brows, and neither man moved to brush them away. They wore them like blessings. "I wonder," Meldir whispered, "if anyone will ever come here again. If some other pilgrim, years from now, will find their way to this place and feel something stir in the soil, something wordless but holy. Will they know what lies here? Will they sense it, even if they cannot name it?" "They will feel it," Elarion said. "Not all things must be understood to be known. There are truths that speak in silence, that dwell in the bones of the earth and the curve of a tree's roots. They will not know the names, perhaps, nor the stories, but they will feel the hush. They will feel the reverence, and they will wonder, and in wondering, they will honor it." For a time they sat in stillness again, as the sky shifted from deep rose to violet, and the first stars blinked slowly into being, like shy thoughts emerging from dreams. The forest darkened, but not in menace, in solemnity. Night in Lothlórien was not absence, but presence, not a closing but a veiling, a soft drawing of the world inward. Sounds grew fewer, more distant, until the only thing to be heard was the sound of breath, of leaves settling, of the faint ripple of wind through branches that seemed to speak of ages past. Eventually Elarion stood, and Meldir rose with him. The man from Gondor looked older somehow, not in body but in soul, weathered not by hardship but by reverence. He looked back once at the base of Hiralorn, where the mound of earth lay undisturbed and almost indistinct amid the natural swell of the roots, and he placed a hand over his heart. "I will not speak of this place to many," he said, "but I will speak of it when it matters, and I will remember not just the act but the feeling, the way the forest looked, the way the air trembled, the way grief sat beside me like a friend who does not speak but never leaves. I will remember the silence, and how it said more than words ever could." Elarion nodded, and together they stepped back into the trees, the path folding behind them like a book gently closed. The light of the stars filtered through the branches in shimmering lattices, and the night grew deeper, wrapping around them not as shadow, but as a shawl woven of old songs and older stillness. The leaves above rustled in gentle rhythm, as if humming a lullaby meant for those who remember, and the moss beneath their feet softened their tread, like earth choosing not to wake from the dream. And behind them Hiralorn stood unmoving, unchanged, eternal, as all things become when they are made sacred by memory. They walked beneath a canopy no longer gold but silvered with starlight. The leaves now turned into quiet mirrors that caught the pale shimmer of the moon and reflected it downward in 1,000 flickering fragments, like dreams cascading from the higher realms into the sleeping world below. There was something sacred in the night of Lothlórien, something that went beyond the hush of absence or the softness of slumber. It was a night that seemed not only to rest, but to remember, to cradle the very breath of time within its boughs, and to release it gently into the stillness between moments. The very air was slower now, thicker with meaning, touched by the perfume of unseen blossoms that bloomed only when the sun was gone, their fragrance rising like a hymn sung in a language older than light. Ellarion's stride was measured and deliberate, not out of weariness but out of reverence, for every step upon the forest floor felt as though it pressed against something hallowed, something that bore the weight of more than just their feet. The moss was thick and velvety, yielding like memory beneath their soles. And the trees around them seemed to lean closer now, not menacingly but tenderly, as if drawn by the quiet pulse of sorrow that still lingered on the skin of these two travelers. The forest had not forgotten what had just transpired beneath the boughs of Lothlórien. It carried it now like a whispered prayer caught in the throat of the world, and it breathed that prayer with every sigh of wind, every creak of limb, every drop of dew suspended like a tear on the tip of a leaf. Meldir spoke again, his voice low but steady, and it came not as an interruption to the silence, but as part of it, woven into the ambient murmur of the night like another note in an endless lullaby. "There's a thought that has settled within me," he said slowly, "and I cannot tell whether it has grown there of its own accord or if the trees have planted it in me. But it is this, that grief, when carried with love, becomes a kind of reverence, that to weep is not weakness, but the body's way of giving shape to absence, and of saying, 'This mattered, this changed me, this left a mark no time can erase.'" Ellarien nodded, the motion so slight that it might have gone unnoticed, but his voice followed, soft and luminous, like the light between branches. "You speak with the voice of one who has known the edge of sorrow," he replied, "and who has not turned away. That is a rare thing among men. Most would rather bury their pain beneath stones of distraction and busyness, piling upon themselves the weight of tasks and ambitions to smother the ache beneath. But you have allowed it to breathe, and in doing so, you have allowed it to transform you." Meldir looked upward into the layers of moon-drenched branches above, and his breath caught, not in fear, but in awe. "It is strange," he murmured, "but I feel that this forest sees us, not just with eyes, but with memory. It recognizes the shape of our thoughts, the tremble of our hearts. I have walked through many woods in my life, but none have ever made me feel so seen and so small." Elarien's smile was touched with sadness, yet there was peace in it too, the peace of one who has made his home in longing. "Lothlórien is a mirror," he said, "not like Galadriel's pool, which shows visions of what was and what may yet be. No, this forest reflects what you are in the stillness between thoughts. It strips away the noise, the illusions, the armor we wear even to ourselves, and what remains is who you have always been. Sometimes it is unbearable." They paused by a brook, narrow and clear, winding through the roots like a silver thread sewn into a great green tapestry. The water sang softly, its voice like the breath of someone just woken from a dream, uncertain but sweet. Lothlórien knelt beside it and dipped his fingers into the current, letting it flow around his skin as though measuring the temperature of memory itself. "There was a time," he said, "long ago, when I thought I could carry the whole of Lothlórien within me, that, if I remembered enough, every path, every name, every story, I could preserve it against the creeping shadow. But I have come to see that memory is not preservation. It is transformation. We do not keep the past by holding it still, but by letting it shape us into something worthy of its beauty." Meldir sat beside him, drawing his cloak around his shoulders, his gaze unfixed, not lost, but deep. "There is something terrifying in that," he whispered, "that to remember truly is to change, that there is no way back, only through. That grief does not end, but becomes a companion, like a shadow walking beside you, not to frighten, but to remind you that you are still walking." Lothlórien looked at him, and in the starlight his eyes glistened like morning dew on ancient stone. "Yes," he said, "that is what we do now. We walk. We carry, not just a vial, not just a story, but a way of being. We carry the memory of peace, and we offer it to a world that has forgotten how to be still. That is the task the lady set before us, not merely to bury, but to bear." A breeze stirred the surface of the brook, rippling the reflection of the trees above into trembling fragments, and for a moment it seemed as though the whole sky were weeping, not in sorrow, but in tenderness. The stars quivered, the leaves leaned down to listen, and the wind sighed like a breath released after holding for too long. They sat for a while longer, saying nothing more, letting the forest speak in the hush that followed, and in that hush was the rhythm of old songs, of stories passed from mouth to mouth until they became the very shape of the land, of farewells whispered into the bark of trees, and promises sealed with the press of hands into soil. It was not silence, it was memory breathing. And when at last they rose and turned once more toward the heart of the path, it was not with heaviness, but with a strange lightness, as though the forest itself now carried part of their burden, as though Silmarillion and the stars and the listening brook had gathered up their sorrow and woven it into the tapestry of the world, not to diminish it, but to make it part of something larger, something beautiful, something eternal. They moved onward through the shadow-hollowed boughs, no longer as strangers upon a path, but as part of the very rhythm of the forest itself, as though each footstep whispered a forgotten verse of a song only the trees could sing fully, and the air around them no longer held itself aloof, but seemed to embrace them, to draw them inward, as if the forest had begun to recognize them not only as travelers but as mourners, as keepers of memory and shapers of silence. There was something profoundly intimate about the stillness now, something not merely quiet but attentive, as though the leaves themselves leaned in closer to listen, and the light, pale and thread-like, wove itself like spun silver through the canopy, casting shifting veils over their faces as they passed. The scent of moss and earth and something older, perhaps the memory of rain from 1,000 years ago, curled in the air, and it mingled with the breath of the travelers until it seemed they were inhaling not merely air, but the soul of the place itself. Meldir's steps had slowed again, not from weariness but from awe, as though he feared to disturb the sanctity of the moment with the sound of movement. His eyes traced the contours of every tree, every fern, every gnarled root that broke through the forest floor like the backs of sleeping giants, and finally his voice emerged in a hush, as though he were speaking not only to Lothlórien, but to the forest itself. "There is something I've come to understand," he said slowly, his tone thick with thought, and I don't know if it came from watching the trees or listening to the wind or simply from walking beside you in silence for so long. But it's this, that the world does not change through great deeds alone, or even through wars and victories and kings and crowns. It changes most deeply in the places where no one is watching. In the stillness of two souls sharing sorrow beneath an old tree, or in the planting of a seed that may never bloom while the planter still lives to see it. And I think that is what you elves have known all along, what we men still struggle to learn, that the smallest moments, when steeped in care and remembrance, carry a power that echoes far longer than we dare to believe. Lothlórien's reply came slowly, as though drawn not from intellect but from the marrow of his being, his words shaped by long centuries of reflection. "Yes," he said, his voice low and even, like the murmur of water beneath ice. "You speak of the quiet shaping, of the unseen transformation, the alchemy of sorrow into song, of loss into legacy. And you are right. The world does not remember what is loud. It remembers what is true. A sword may end a war, but a lullaby sung in the ruins afterward, that is what rebuilds the world. That is what lingers. That is what gives sorrow meaning." They passed beneath a tall and ancient arch of intertwined trees, whose trunks spiraled upward like dancers caught in an eternal embrace. And the light beneath their boughs was different, cooler, deeper, as though they had stepped not merely into another part of the forest, but into another time entirely. Here, even the air seemed to slow, and every sound, the rustle of a leaf, the creak of a distant bough, was magnified, made meaningful, as though the forest wished to mark this place as sacred. A low, delicate fog crept along the roots, softening the edges of the world, blurring the line between waking and dreaming. "I have spent much of my life," Meldir continued, his voice now tinged with something like regret, "believing that knowledge was the highest form of understanding, that if I could trace every genealogy, every historical account, every fragment of elven script carved into ruined walls, I might come to comprehend the heart of this world. But now I see that knowledge without reverence is a hollow thing, like reading a love letter in a language you've never heard spoken aloud. The truth of a thing lives not in its fact, but in its feeling. And that is what I have learned here." Lothlórien reached out, brushing his fingers gently along the rough bark of one of the twisted arching trees, his touch more like a greeting than an examination. "And in that," he said, "you have become more elven than many who bear the name. For what we treasure most is not our immortality, nor even our songs and crafts and towers of moonlit stone. What we cherish is presence, the ability to be utterly within a moment, to feel it fully, to let it shape us as rivers shape the stone, not by force, but by enduring touch." The forest around them seemed to shiver slightly. not with wind, but with agreement, as if even the trees had drawn closer to listen. A bird sang once from a branch high above, just a single tremulous note, and then was silent again, as if it too were overcome with the solemnity of what was being said. "And yet," Meldir said, his voice thickening with emotion, "it hurts, does it not? This kind of knowing, this kind of presence. It wounds even as it awakens. I feel as though my heart has been split open in this place, not broken, but made wider, more vulnerable. And I wonder, is that not what it means to love something truly? To let it cut you so deeply that you bleed not pain, but reverence?" Lothlórien turned to him, and for a long moment he simply looked not at a man, but at a soul, bare and bright in the shadow of the woods. "Yes," he said, and that one word carried within it all the sadness and sweetness of 1,000 years. To love is to be pierced, not by cruelty, but by beauty so vast it cannot be contained. And in that piercing, we remember that we are alive, that we are bound not by time, but by meaning. The path curved again, narrowing slightly as though funneling them toward some final truth, and the trees here grew straighter, more solemn, their trunks smooth and white as if carved from the bones of mountains. Their branches held no leaves now, only strands of soft hanging moss that swayed gently, brushing the shoulders of the travelers like benedictions bestowed by unseen hands. And in that corridor of silence and pale light, the two walked together, not as elf and man, not as guide and guest, but as two beings whose souls had touched something eternal. They did not speak again for a long time, not because there was nothing more to say, but because the forest had said it all, and they were wise enough now to listen. As the path wound deeper into the heart of the forest, the world around them changed once more, not in any sudden shift, but in a gradual unfolding, a quiet revelation, like the slow blossoming of a night flower, whose petals respond only to starlight. The trees here no longer soared high and golden as they had in the outer woods of Lothlórien, but grew closer together, their trunks pale and smooth, their roots intertwining with a kind of deliberate intimacy, as though each tree leaned upon its neighbor in silent communion, bound not merely by soil and sun, but by shared memory. The canopy above was dense, yet translucent in places, allowing shafts of moonlight to pierce through in long, graceful columns, like the beams of forgotten lighthouses, guiding lost souls through a sea of leaves. The air had grown cooler, though not with chill, but with clarity, and each breath seemed to carry with it the faintest taste of something beyond understanding, something that lingered on the edge of recollection, like the memory of a lullaby once sung long ago in a voice you loved but could no longer name. The path beneath their feet was no longer marked by stone or worn earth, but by the gentle pressure of footsteps long vanished, a trail shaped by intention more than by use, and every bend in the path felt like a turning inward, a folding of thought into reflection, as if they walked not only through the forest, but through the corridors of their own hearts, echoing with things once unspoken. The silence around them had taken on a new character, not empty, but contemplative, like a waiting breath before the words of a long-delayed confession. Meldir slowed again, and this time he stopped entirely, standing beneath a low-hanging arch of branches that bowed toward him like an old friend. And he turned to Ilarion with eyes wide, not in fear but in wonder. a wonder that held within it a trembling grief, like the beauty of a sunrise seen through tears. "There is something I must ask you," he said, and his voice, though steady, carried the weight of something long held and carefully kept, something that has stirred within me since we began this journey, but which I have only now found the courage to speak aloud. Lothlórien inclined his head slightly, saying nothing, but the softness in his gaze invited all things. Meldir looked around at the forest first, as if seeking permission, as if needing to be held in the gaze of the trees to say what must be said. "You speak of love as piercing," he began, "of grief as a form of reverence, of memory as something that lives and breathes and weeps. And I have come to believe you. I have come to feel those truths in my bones. But there is another side to that, one that I do not know how to name. It is this: what do we do when we fear that we cannot hold it all, when the love we feel is too great, the sorrow too vast, the beauty too blinding? When memory ceases to be a lantern and becomes a fire that threatens to consume us? How do you bear it, Lothlórien? How do you carry so much and still walk forward?" There was silence then, not hesitation, but depth. And Lothlórien stepped toward him, his movements as fluid and slow as water winding through stone. When he spoke, his voice did not rise. It fell gently, like leaves from an ancient branch, soft and certain. "I have asked myself that question 1,000 times," he said, "and every time the answer changes, just as rivers change course with the seasons. Sometimes I carry it in song, turning the weight of memory into melody, into something that can float upon the wind and be shared. Sometimes I plant it in silence, burying it like a seed and waiting, sometimes for years to see what will grow, and sometimes I simply let it ache. I sit with it in the deepest hours of the night, and I do not try to transform it or escape it. I just let it be. Because there is no strength without sorrow, Meldir, and no wisdom that has not been wept into being." Meldir bowed his head, his hands tightening around the edges of his cloak as though anchoring himself, and when he looked up again there was something different in him, something not lighter, but more whole. That is perhaps the hardest thing of all," he murmured, "to let it ache, to accept that the ache itself is part of the meaning, not a flaw in the pattern, but the very thread that makes the tapestry true. I think we are taught to hide our sorrow, to dress it in silence or laughter or pride, because we fear that to show it is to seem weak. But here in this place, I feel as though the sorrow itself is honored, that it is the offering, not the burden." Lothlórien placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and the gesture was neither comfort nor command, but presence, pure, steady presence. "You are learning what few ever do," he said, "that to weep for something beautiful is to have honored it truly, that to remember what is lost is to keep it alive in the only way that matters, and that grief, when given voice, becomes love's second language." The path bent again, and as they walked once more, the moonlight above thickened, not in brightness but in texture, like a mist of silver drifting through the air, and the forest floor sparkled faintly with the dew of unseen flowers, their fragrance so delicate it felt more like an emotion than a scent. The trees here grew taller again, but thinner, their trunks smooth as marble and pale as bone, and their branches swayed gently without wind, as if moved by thought alone. The silence deepened, yet became richer, more musical, as though filled with the echoes of song sung by those who once passed this way long ago, in times when elves danced by starlight, and men still whispered the names of trees as if they were sacred. And in this place, where time curved inward like a ring closing upon itself, Maldir and Ilarion walked not as they had before, not as traveler and guide, nor even as friends, but as companions in a sacred rite, pilgrims of sorrow and beauty alike, bearing the memory of what had been buried, not as a weight to be shed, but as a light to be carried into the long dusk ahead. The forest began to open gently, not abruptly as one might expect of a glade revealed or a clearing won, but with the soft grace of a veil being drawn back by unseen hands, as though the trees themselves, having witnessed the culmination of what had been carried to Lothlórien, now chose to give way, not in retreat, but in recognition, acknowledging that what had been planted in silence had now begun its quiet echo. The sky above was no longer masked by tangled branches, but stretched wide and luminous, and the stars glimmered not distantly but intimately, as if they had drawn nearer to the earth, compelled by the gravity of sorrow transfigured into meaning. There was a hush here not born of absence but of reverence, and the wind moved with a slower, more deliberate breath, curling around the figures of the two travelers like a shawl woven from the threads of time and memory, wrapping them not in warmth, but in the acknowledgement of what had passed and what must continue. Maldir turned his gaze upward, eyes wide with something that could no longer be named merely wonder, for it had passed through too many transformations, first curiosity, then sorrow, then awe, and had now settled into that rare and sacred stillness that exists only when a soul knows it is witnessing the threshold of the eternal. "It feels," he said softly, his voice fragile yet clear, "as though we have stepped outside of time itself, as though this place lies not within the bounds of hours or days, but within the breath between heartbeats, the stillness where truth waits to be felt rather than known." Ilarion's eyes, reflecting starlight and shadow in equal measure, did not stray from the sky as he answered, his tone as quiet as leaves drifting in moonlight. "That is because we have," he said. "There are places in the world, rare and hallowed, where the veil thins, not between worlds, but between what is and what could have been, between the song sung and the silence before it. This, Maldir, is one such place. It does not belong to maps, nor does it yield to name. It is shaped only by memory, and tended only by those who have dared to mourn what others have forgotten." The stars above shimmered faintly, pulsing like the breath of distant fires, and the earth beneath their feet felt less like ground and more like the resting skin of something vast and dreaming. The trees here had drawn back to form a circle, and in its center a stone lay partially buried in moss, simple, uncarved, and worn smooth by the passage of years, and yet it radiated a quiet gravity, as though it marked not a grave but a promise, not an end but a vow kept in silence. Maldir stepped toward it slowly as one approaches a relic, not because it is grand, but because it is beloved, and he knelt before it with the same reverence he had shown beneath Lothlórien. But there was something different now in his stillness, a gentler sorrow, a peace touched by the ache of farewell. He laid his hand upon the stone, feeling the cool weight of it beneath his palm, and closed his eyes. "There is no one here to speak the names," he murmured, "and yet it feels as though they are already known, that the names live not in voice, but in presence, that the earth remembers them, even if the world does not." Hilarion stood behind him, his hands resting lightly at his sides, as though he too bore a weight that was no longer burden but inheritance. "That is the final gift of remembrance," he said, "not to enshrine what was, but to become it. You carry their names even if you never heard them. You speak their song even if you do not know the tune, and that is why this journey matters, not because we have laid down a vial or whispered beneath a tree, but because in walking, in weeping, in wondering, we have let the memory shape us. We have let it root itself in us, and in doing so, we have ensured it will not die." The wind stirred again, and the trees swayed gently, as if in solemn agreement, their leaves catching the starlight and scattering it like 1,000 whispered blessings. The moss beneath their feet glowed faintly now, not with light but with life, and the air itself shimmered with something unseen, perhaps the presence of those who had come before, or perhaps the deep exhalation of the forest, content that something sacred had been witnessed and would be carried forward. Meldir stood slowly, his eyes wet but calm, and when he turned to face Hilarion, he did so not as a man overwhelmed, but as one transformed. "When I return to Gondor," he said, "they will ask me what I saw. They will ask me for tales, for marvels, for signs of elven magic. And I will tell them, I walked with an elf in silence. I buried a vial beneath a tree. I wept for what was lost, and in doing so, I found what still remains. And if they do not understand, I will not fault them, for understanding is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as carrying. What we carry, only we can know its weight and its grace." Hilarion's smile was soft, like the first breath of dawn across the still surface of a lake. "Then you will speak true," he said, "and those who are ready to listen will hear more than words. They will hear the silence between them, and they will understand." They turned then, not with haste but with the calm of those who have completed a circle and now return, not to where they began, but to a place remade by the passage of their own footsteps. The path awaited, lit by stars and lined with memory, and the forest, no longer a place of mystery, had become a companion, gentle, watchful, eternal. And as they walked away from the glade, from the stone, from the sacred breath between worlds, the wind rose once more, and in its sigh was no farewell, but a blessing. For what had been buried would bloom in silence, what had been wept for would sing again, and what had been remembered would never be lost.